if you could all join me in welcoming our panelists this evening. First off, we have, if you guys can wave when I say your name, Dr. Steve Smith. He's the principal investigator for the Camden Burials project, and he currently works as a research professor at the South Carolina Institute of Archaeology and Anthropology at the University of South Carolina. Is his colleague, Mr. James Legg, is a historical archaeologist for the South Carolina Institute of Archaeology and Anthropology. He specializes in battlefields and military material culture with an expertise in metal artifact conservation. So if you could please welcome. Down the line, we have Dr. Bill Stevens. He is the head forensic anthropologist and deputy coroner for the Richland County Coroner and Medical Examiner's Office here in Columbia and South Carolina. And he also was part of the Camden burial process. Last but certainly never least, Dr. Natty Atwell is another forensic anthropologist and also deputy coroner for the Richland County Coroner and Medical Examiner's Office in Columbia, South Carolina. Before I hand it over to our panelists, I've been informed that Mr. Bostic would like to say a few words.
I cannot hear you.
Before I hand it over to the panelists, Mr. Bostic will be saying a few words.
So rather than go through all that fancy name, you just need to learn the acronym SCIA for Jim and Steve. My name is Doug Bostic. I'm the CEO of the South Carolina Battleground Trust, one half of the Liberty Trail in partnership with the American Battlefield Trust, and I also chair the Camden Burials project. The project kicked off today. The procession went through all the public schools between Columbia and Camden, and went through Fort Jackson. Now, I'll tell you what, if you want to have hope for America, every school turned out the entire student body. I'm a big sap, I wept through every school. It was a very emotional experience. We went through Fort Jackson, they had 2,000 recruits lining the streets, and fired an artillery salute in honor of the fallen soldiers from the Battle of Camden. So I want to cover a couple of things quickly before they get started so they don't have to dispense with some of the details of a always unfolding project. So we recovered 14 soldiers, 12 Continentals, one that we believe is a militiaman from North Carolina. He also has Native American ancestry. And then we have one British soldier from the 71st Regiment of Foot, a Highlander. Now, you'll find out at the ceremonies over the weekend, the Native American remains will not be part of the ceremony. We're going to do that privately with the Catawba tribe and the Lumbee tribe. We don't know his tribal connection, but those are the two most likely tribes. And so we'll do something with them at a later date. The other change to the plan is our plan all along was to reinter these men where they were found. Well, once they were certified to be U.S. Army soldiers, by law, the Secretary of the Army is their custodian, since we do not yet know their descendants, although we intend to attempt that through DNA. So the tradition of the Army is to bury recovered soldiers at national cemeteries. We pushed back on that really hard, and we advocated that they needed to return to the Camden battlefield because it provided context and tells their story. And so the negotiated position was that we're going to establish a cemetery on the Battle of Camden site. So they won't go where they were found, they'll go at a cemetery, and that's going to happen later. So we never intended for the reinterments to be public because it was going to involve heavy machinery and such. And the other thing is, when we got to figure out where we're going to put the cemetery, and then Jim and Steve get out there and do the archaeology for that place. And so that'll take a little time to put all that together. But we've come to a good agreement, I think, with the Army, and I think this will keep those men where they deserve to be. And so, again, back to the loyalists, we've not done DNA on that person at the request of the tribes. We have sampled DNA on everybody else, and we do intend to try to trace that ancestry. We've had lots of families that said, you know, my whatever great-grandfather was in the Maryland line and killed at Camden. Can I take the test? And we've said to them all, absolutely, we'll help you with when the time is right to do that. So these are four of the smartest people I know and have been really an integral part. An integral part to this entire project. What Steve and Jim and Bill and Maddie and lots of other people on their teams have done is absolutely incredible. It took me the longest time, you should know, to get Maddie to not call me Mr. Bostic, but to call me Doug. She was making me feel incredibly old. And then she whipped out a reference to the OG, and she was shocked that I actually knew what that meant. I didn't know what it meant, I just faked it. I thought I would just ride with the tide. So with that, let me turn you over to the people that really know what's going on in this project. Jim, Steve, Bill, and Maddie.
So I'm going to be very brief because I look out and I see a whole lot of familiar faces who know a lot more about the Camden battlefield than I will ever know. And I know they're taking notes. And I know I'll hear about it later. So I'm going to keep this very generic and very quick. So the British had always been interested in the South because they always thought that there were a lot of loyalists down here. And as things bogged down up north, they decided to turn their attention southward. And eventually on May 12, 1780, they captured Charleston. And immediately they began to spread into the backcountry using a tactic that perhaps we tried to use in Afghanistan, capturing those important resource points, those city, little villages in the backcountry, and occupying them, including Augusta, 96, Camden, Georgetown, Winsboro, those kind of places. And Camden sort of seemed like the keystone in that arc of backcountry villages, which they hoped to occupy and then subdue the rebellion. As Charleston fell, there was a contingent of about 1,400 American Continentals on their way to reinforce Charleston under General Baron DeKalb. As he marched through North Carolina, he found out that Charleston had fell, so he settled in at Buffalo Ford, also called Wilcox's Mill, and waited for the Congress to take the next step. The next step that they took was to bring the hero of Saratoga down south to take command of whatever forces were left and to rebuild the army. His name was Horatio Gates. He arrived about July, 25th, and even though he looked around and saw people were starving, there wasn't much food, there wasn't much supply, he decided that, well, we can either starve here or we can start on the march. So 2 days later, he put them on the march. And he took them in a direct route. His idea was to put pressure on and capture Camden, South Carolina. Well, he had two options. He could go through the country that was full of loyalists and no food, or he could go an indirect route towards Salisbury, North Carolina, and then farther south. It did have a lot of patriots that would support them. He chose the former. Why he did that? Perhaps he was concerned that if he did not go directly towards and into South Carolina immediately, that patriots in South Carolina would think they were being left behind. As he marched southward, he tried to rein in various militias that were supposedly to join him. Behind him was the Virginia militia, and operating in South Carolina independently was Edward Cassell and the North Carolina militia, who was very reluctant to join Gates. And eventually Gates had to go find him and get him and bring and round him up. Eventually they got to Rugeley's Mill, which is about 13 miles north of Camden, and settled in and began to plan what they were going to do. What the Gates decided to do was to move southward towards a place called Sanders Creek. He hoped to get there and putting greater pressure on the British. Unknown to him, the British knew where he was and what he was, not what he was planning to do, but where he was. And under those forces were Lord Francis Walden, who was already in Camden, Lord Charles Cornwallis, the commander of forces for the British in the Southern Campaign, who was in Charleston but quickly rode north and joined forces with Walden. Among their crew was Lieutenant Colonel Master Tarleton, who was known as Bloody Band, who had perhaps massacred many people at Waxhaw. That's a sort of a controversial subject, but whatever happened, casualties were enormously offside in favor of the British. Lots of Americans died trying to surrender. The order of battle, which we will talk about in more detail, is up before you right now. There was 1st Maryland, 2nd Maryland, some light infantry, very little cavalry. The cavalry, Colonel William Washington actually wanted to join Gates, but he turned him away. Gates wasn't interested in cavalry too much. And eventually, on the August 14th, 2 days before they would march out towards Camden, Virginia militia stumbled in to Rugeley's Mill. So the plan was, as this map shows, for Gates to get to Saunders Creek. It was a defensible position. Rugeley's Mill really wasn't a defensible position. So he tried to get to Saunders Creek, where there was a creek, there was a high ground, and it would put more pressure on the British in Camden. Unfortunately, what he didn't know was that his plan of march was going to intersect with Cornwallis's plan of march. That evening, or I'd say the evening of August 15th, Gates issued molasses and beef to his soldiers, which if you try that sometime, it does not help the digestion, and many of the troops were lost on the march heading towards Camden, leaving the ranks to take care of gastronomical issues. Marching out of Rugeley's Mill at 10 o'clock was the army with a little bit of cavalry under Armand in front, and on either flank some light infantry under Porterfield and Armstrong. Behind them were the 1st Maryland Brigade, the 2nd Maryland Brigade, the North Carolina Militia, and then Virginia Militia. Marching down the road, you have to imagine what they were marching through. This was all prime virgin pine forest, so the trees were huge. You know, you couldn't put your arms around these trees. High canopy, 35, 40 feet above for any branches. High grass, meadowland, in a sense, in the woods. The trees were far enough apart that they did not hinder any cavalry maneuvers whatsoever during the battle. And they began marching down the road. Unknown to them, Cornwallis had heard about where Gates had camped, and decided that was an indefensible position, and he decided to march toward them. Ironically, leaving at 10 o'clock at night from Logtown, which was just a little village, few houses north of Camden, the village of Camden itself. So through that night, the two armies were marching towards each other. As the British crossed and you'll see on the battlefield a place called Gum Swamp. They stopped and reformed and were pretty tight together as they marched up the road. Then, marching up the road, one of the people in the van looked out and said, "Who's that?" And the other side said, "Who are you?" Shots fired. Both the British, being British, immediately charged against Armand's cavalry. Armand's cavalry were thrown back. Porterfield and Armstrong came up on either flank and began firing into the British Legion. The British Legion was thrown back. Then the British infantry followed, and a skirmish broke out on both sides. Then both sides realized that they had seen who they were meeting. Cornwallis was quite happy. He didn't have to march another additional few miles up the road to attack that morning. Gates, on the other hand, was thinking, now what? Both sides fell back, and the Americans began to try to discombobulate themselves from what had happened with the cavalry. They retreated back into the army. The cavalry had gone into the 1st Maryland, got them discombobulated. One piece of artillery was turned and broken by the horses, so they were already started the battle with one less artillery piece. And they began to line up. They had a brief discussion. What are we going to do? We can't back up, the wagons are behind us. We've got to fight. So they began lining up. Meanwhile, the British, under Cornwallis, decided it's going to be daylight in about 2 hours. Everybody take a break, take a nap. When daylight comes, we'll deploy. So that's what happened. Gates got his army together and deployed. And here's where people debate for many years whether or not he made a big mistake or not. He put his militia on his left flank, which would be the east side of the battlefield. Here you can see some various maps of the deployment. But basically, the Virginia militia were on the very far left flank, and then the North Carolina militia, and then the 2nd Maryland Brigade filled out over to the swamps. Both sides realized that there were swamps and declivities on either side, so that they would not have to protect their flanks. So it was going to be a front-on-front battle. Gates put the 1st Maryland in the back in the reserve and waited till morning. In the morning, Cornwallis began his deployment. He put his regulars, 33rd and the 23rd, on his right flank. And they began deploying to the left, coming up in column, and trying to stretch their people out because they didn't have enough people to cover that huge front of militia, the North Carolina and Virginia militia. On the left side, he put Lord Walden, the Volunteers of Ireland, and the North Carolina Loyalists. Now, the British didn't have really any militia in the militia sense. They were all veterans. They were all hardcore soldiers who'd been through a lot. The Americans, on the other hand, had a little issue with their militia. The Virginia militia were pretty tired. They had come in late. They were starving and exhausted from their march from Virginia. But in any case, they lined up. That morning, here's a deployment showing the declivities using a LiDAR map. So you can see the anchors on both sides, how their flanks were anchored so that people could not get through the swamps on either side. Initial lineup also on the topographic map. As daylight came, the American artillery officer looked down the road and saw the British deploying, and he said to an aide named Arthur Williams, "Sir, they're deploying, should I fire?" And Arthur Williams said, "Sure." And the battle opened with artillery fire as the British were trying to get their lines straightened out. Williams rode back to the second line and saw Gates, General Gates, and he said, "They're deploying. If we get some people out front, we can blunt their attack." Gates said, make it so. Williams rode up to the Virginia militia and the North Carolina militia, trying to get some volunteers to come forward to fire behind the trees to stop the British coming on. They were coming on with their bayonets, like the British always do, charging straight forward. Then the artillery on both sides.
Hold on. Please switch.
Okay, right now.
Oh, it's okay. You can switch mics here. And I'll take the walk down.
Oh, it's dying.
Yes.
So am I. So the artillery opens fire. This is August. This is August, sultry, hot day. It's going to be a really hot day, but it's also lots of humidity. So this gun smoke is laying over the battlefield, and both sides are becoming very smoky, and no one can see much what's going on. Unfortunately, Virginia militia, seeing the British coming forward with their bayonets, decided this was not a good day to fight, and they began to flee. In fact, one of the people said that he is quoted saying something to the effect that he was one of the first to flee. He didn't know why he was going to flee, but it just seemed that everybody else was going to do it, so he decided he'd be the first. And off he took. And like an accordion, the Virginia militia, the North Carolina militia fled. Now, last week, incidentally, I gave this talk to my 50th VMI reunion. And they let me know afterwards that I was disparaging the Virginia militia. They let me know about Newmarket. In any case, they had no excuse. They fled. The battle began then to become two battles. As the 1st Maryland moved forward, they had the discipline to open their ranks and let the militia come through. And then they came forward, but they were hit by the 23rd and the 33rd. On the American right flank, we don't know what happened. We think that the Americans pushed the volunteers of Ireland back for briefly. Maybe Lord Walden was captured, but the battle was enveloped in smoke, and it was a fierce battle, as we will see the number of lead shot in the areas where this heavy battle occurred. But two battles were occurring. On the right, as I said, we don't know what was happening, but it was a fierce battle. On the left, the 1st Maryland had to fall back and kept falling back. And as that happened, it became like a lever. The left flank was falling back while the other flank was staying steady. Cornwallis saw the gap between the two and sent the 71st and British Legion between them. The cavalry got behind the Continentals, and then the Continentals had to fight their way off the battlefield in small groups. Now, I don't think that the Continentals ran away. I think they broke off into small groups, fought their way off of 10 to 20 people, hanging together, retreating, turning, firing, and then falling back. As their men fell, they could not pick them up, they just had to leave them. Losses, who knows? The British speak of 900, but that's probably not right. A lot of the Continentals showed up later in Hillsborough, North Carolina, where we lost 32 Continental officers. The British, of course, knew how many they had lost: 68 killed, 245 wounded, 11 missing. But the Volunteers of Ireland had a huge casualty rate, indicating that the Continentals on the right flank put up a heck of a battle. And the 33rd also took a lot of artillery fire. And the canister, the American canister, significantly impacted the 33rd. And these people were not going to be replaced. So the Americans, in many senses, even though they lost a lot of battles, they kept attriting the British until eventually they would win this war. That's a very brief overview. There's lots of more I could talk about, but we need to move on. with the archaeology and the forensics. Thank you.
Can anybody hear me?
Yes.
All right, what I said a minute ago was if I look like I'm ducking, it's because the light is directly in my face. So excuse me, Pastor. Okay, what I have is a fairly brief summary of the Camden archaeological project from its beginning all the way through up to and including the burial project that we did in the fall. Now, there was very little done with the Camden battlefield in terms of any effort at preservation and anything else, beyond the original little DAR park that was established in 1909, a 6-acre park around the academy. And nothing else happened until 1996. And in 1996, the Catawba Valley Land Trust began negotiating with the Bowater Paper Company, who owned almost all the battlefield. Is that better? Am I good? Okay. Anyway, Bowater owned almost all the battlefield and operated it as commercial pine stands for paper and timber. And Catawba Valley decided, okay, are we now perfect? Anyway, Catawba Valley was in negotiations with the paper company to preserve the battlefield. And they didn't have the money to try to buy the thing outright. So they went for a conservation easement. And that would guarantee simply that the property would never be developed for anything other than pine trees. And that process took several years, and by the time it was done, the management of the preservation process had already moved to the Palmetto Conservation Foundation. But to this day, Catawba Valley still holds that easement within the property that is now actually owned by preservation entities. So that was in 1996 that this process began. And for some reason, I was deemed to be somebody who had some notion of where the Battle of Camden was actually fought, and I was asked to draw a boundary between 300 or 400 acres in size on the paper company property that I thought would encompass the core of the battlefield. I did have some notion of where I thought it was fought, and as it turned out, I couldn't have drawn a better boundary, and it was largely accidental. I did not have a detailed knowledge of where things were, but it worked out just fine. The easement ended up being the core of the battlefield, which is now a little less than 800 acres, I think, in terms of total preservation. Is that right, Doug? So we've got a sizable thing preserved there. And initially, as I say, the property was not owned by preservation entities. It was still owned by the paper company. And in 1998, they did an enormous clear-cutting operation on about 70% of the conservation easement property, which is what you do if you're a paper company and you grow commercial pine trees. It was still kind of a miscommunication, and we were real surprised when that happened. But when I saw what they had done, particularly on the west side of the highway, I thought, well, here's a chance to see what sort of archaeological integrity there is left on the battlefield. And I say that because the battlefield had undergone at least 3 decades of relic hunting by people with metal detectors. And they had removed easily 90% of the artifacts from the Battle of Camden. But as Steve and I have known for a long time, that kind of activity does not kill the evidence for a battle, because the ghost of the material that is left still represents the original distribution. And I'll show you what I mean here in a minute. This photo is from that clear-cut survey that we did in 1998. Now, this was the first little sample we did. It might have been 5 acres altogether. And it yielded a total of 47 artifacts, which doesn't sound like much, but it told me that if this was extrapolated over a couple of hundred acres, that it would tell us a lot about where the Battle of Camden took place. And indeed, that has been the case. And I should say also that if we had the knowledge and the metal detectors that we have now, we wouldn't have found 47 artifacts. We would have found probably 300 in a clearing like this. But anyway, that was the first effort. And there was nothing official about it. We just asked Bowater if we could do it. They said, okay. I did it with some volunteers on a couple of weekends, and we put the records away, and that was fine. Beginning in 2001, Steve began to get pieces of grant money from the Palmetto Conservation Foundation, who, as I said, had become the primary movers in preserving the battlefield. And one of the things that they wanted to do was archaeological assessment. And between 01 and 07 is the last one, Steve got these 3 different pieces of grant money that were essentially a continuous project that we did that resulted in 3 different reports. And we did a variety of things in order to assess the battlefield. The most salient thing we did was a lot more metal detecting. And this has been our primary effort all along. Until last fall, it was almost everything that we did was this huge ongoing metal detecting project. And it was really quite an effort to get the data that we had, because like I said, we were following decades of metal detecting. And we had to be pretty good with metal detectors ourselves. We had to have improved ground conditions like mowing or burning in order to get ahead of those who had gone before us and get a decent sample of material. Now what we did, whenever we had time, whenever we had grant money, or even when we didn't have any grant money, we would do a little block of territory, maybe a little rectangle of half an acre. We would bound that and cover 100% of the surface inside that area. We would map the area, and we would map each individual artifact that we found in that area. These shots range over the last 20 years of metal detecting. Now, our primary mapping method was simply a survey-grade GPS unit. So we were not out there with a transit recording each musket ball and buckshot. We were using a GPS unit to locate these things within maybe a meter or a yard of radius, which is close enough when you're talking about small arms ammunition scattered across a huge battlefield. You wouldn't want to build a house with it, but it's close enough for the kind of distribution that we were looking for. And in this slide, you can maybe see, there's a lot of little orange flags in the center photo. Each one of those is an artifact that is waiting to be recorded with the GPS. Now, here's another version of a slide that I think you've already seen, but as of last fall, we have about 2,900 artifacts from the battlefield, which, when I totaled it up the last time, I was kind of amazed, because again, we are latecomers to this. This place had gotten to be someplace, a battlefield that relic hunters really weren't very interested in because they couldn't find anything. And we've got 2,900 mapped battle artifacts from this battlefield. Now, of course, it's taken us 20 years, more than 20 years. But what you see here is more significant than it looks, because, of course, we have maybe 24 primary accounts, participant accounts of the Battle of Camden. We have the existing terrain. We have some fairly poor 18th century maps and early 19th century maps. But when you take it all together, we know, as Steve said, that the Battle of Camden quickly degenerated into two separate firefights, brigade-sized firefights. Baron DeKalb was basically on an east-west axis across the road. And by the way, the road is the road. The modern Highway 58 is almost exactly the 18th century road from the time of the battle. And Smallwood's brigade, which was originally in reserve, that attempted to move up after the militia ran away, they fought largely on the east side of the road, attempting to come forward far enough to join up with DeKalb. And as we know, the junction was never made. So this is really two separate brigade-sized battles in close proximity to one another. There was always a gap between the two. And what you see here, if somebody says, where was the Battle of Camden fought? You are looking at the Battle of Camden. That's it for real. That's empirical evidence of where the thing was. And the blob on the bottom, if you look at it as a J shape, the red blob on the bottom is DeKalb's battle. And it goes from the swamp there on the left, it crosses the road a little bit, and then it stops. And the material, the upper part of the J, going back up toward the northern boundary, that is Smallwood's battle. And this works so well that it's almost astonishing to you, because normally archaeological evidence ends up being pretty ambiguous and doesn't make sense, and you have to explain it away somehow. I don't have any problem explaining this. This is the Battle of Camden as it is described in the primary sources, and you're looking at the physical evidence for it that was still there in 1998. And we're still digging it up. In fact, I should point out that we can now add maybe another 250 little red dots to the DeKalb portion of this distribution since this map was last updated. So, I'm real happy with this little map. Now, as I said, this place has been hit really hard by relic hunters. And one of the tasks that we undertook during the period when we had some grant money, we did a survey of these collectors, as many as we could find who wanted to cooperate and tell us what they had found and allow us to photograph their artifacts and so forth. And this ended up being a very valuable and rewarding experience. We learned an awful lot about the battlefield from speaking with these guys and walking around the battlefield and mapping what they could remember about what they had found. Now, of course, they weren't plotting things in particular places, so the things they were able to plot that they remembered specifically were gun parts or uniform buttons or shoe buckles and not fired musket balls. These individuals sometimes had 600 or 800 or 1,000 musket balls, and they were essentially a single provenance, or provenance, as some people would say. They were from the Camden battlefield. So anyway, we learned a lot, and I have to say that the fairly subjective map that we made based entirely on their testimony locks in almost perfectly with the distribution that we got from the metal detector. The shape that I projected for the densest part of the battlefield is the same shape as our map. So again, a remarkable result. But in the course of this collector survey, there was discussion of burials that people had found. And I ultimately recorded and numbered burials 1 through 8 based on what people had told me. Unfortunately, most of these burials were lost even then because of the clear cutting, because these people knew that there was a spot in the woods between a couple of trees that they would recognize, and those places were no longer there. The visual frames of reference for these burials that they knew had been found or that they had found themselves were gone. But in 2006, as part of one of these grant projects, we did testing to try to find as many of these as possible. We only found 2. We found what is still to this day burial number 1, which is the 71st guy, the Highlander. We verified him, and that's what's going on in these 3 photos. We opened up the hole that we originally dug, and we didn't dig any more than that. We just dug out the hole that was originally dug and said, yep, here he is. And yes, he is a 71st Regiment of Foot soldier, because we removed 1 button. Now, in 2006, we didn't make any other effort. We did locate burial number 4, which, as Doug mentioned, he ended up being a Native American individual. That guy had no artifacts at the time that we reopened the burial, and according to the testimony of 2 different collectors, there was nothing on that individual but civilian 18th century buttons. So we have no military diagnostics. And he didn't have a musket ball in his body. He had no military diagnostics. And we didn't find any when we reopened it. So we weren't able to say who he was. The context looks good for him being a loyalist from North Carolina. Now, after Doug became heavily involved in the preservation of the Camden battlefield, I had conversations with him and Steve about the possibility of doing a burial project. We knew we had, well, by the time we were in conversation, we had 3 or 4 burials, I forget which. But we knew we had the 2 that collectors had found, and between 2020 and 2021, we found 3 more burials, metal detected. And I should say that because of the pandemic, Steve and I had a huge amount of time to go to the battlefield and cover intensively a lot of ground. And we roughly doubled our density map during that period. So since 2020, we've roughly doubled our data. And in doing that, we found 3 additional burials. A 4th, Steve found metal detecting during the burial project, and another showed up in backhoe work during the project. So we ended up with kind of a problem, because at the time we looked at a research design and a budget for Doug. We knew we had 5 individuals to excavate. And of course, we ended up with 14 men in 7 different locations. Well, did anyone miss anything? I can go back. Okay. All right. We've had some criticism, particularly online. We've had some fairly strident, if not nasty, criticism about the fact that we did this project at all. So with that in mind, I wanted to throw this slide in, and I just put it in yesterday, I think. To my mind, these are the 3 reasons that I really wanted to do this project. And I wanted to do it for a very long time, and I was very happy that Doug wanted to do it, and so we went with it. These are my 3 primary reasons, and I think, Steve, you'll agree that these are pretty much our reasons for wanting to do this thing. And I hate to read PowerPoint slides, so I hope everybody can read this. I'll be completely honest, number 3 is a very strong factor for me. I really wanted, my archaeological interest in excavating these individuals was very strong. But there's also the matter of the fact that they were in absurdly poor graves. They were subject to relic hunting. They were subject to root damage, insect damage, weathering. And I thought they should have decent burials. Now, another factor that is now, of course, a little bit controversial is that I thought we should rebury everyone in exactly the same place. Same angle, same location on the battlefield, so that these guys would forever be markers on the battlefield for anybody who visited. And frankly, I think when people visit battlefields, which is a very entertaining thing to do, of course, but I think when people visit battlefields and study battlefields, they should contemplate the dead that are all around them. And we have that at Camden. There are 300 or 400 dead on the Camden battlefield. We just scratched the surface. Not to say we're going to try to find 300 or 400 individuals, but my point is, a battlefield like this, everybody is there. Nobody was ever dug up and taken away. They are all there. And I think there should be some notion of that when people visit battlefields. So we have the opportunity to do that at Camden. And it looks like it's kind of up in the air about what will ultimately happen. But hopefully, at least they will be on the battlefield. If they're not on the battlefield, or if they are in a central location on the battlefield, we can at least put some sort of little permanent marker at the location of each removed grave. So that when you take that tour path with your pamphlet or your podcast, you'll say, well, somebody was killed right here. And that, I really wanted to see that. I hope that will come to pass in some form or another. Okay, let me zip through these real quickly. I'm already burning up somebody else's time here, but just to look at some of these burials. This is the 71st burial. This was the only reasonably deep, reasonably formal grave. Burial 4. Now, of course, I don't have a photograph for burial 4 because that is no longer something that we can really do. You can't really do public exhibition of Native American remains. So what you see is my friend Tariq Gaffar's pencil drawing plan of the burial before it was removed. And I can guarantee you, I looked very closely, you can see no human remains in the photograph. So we are legal. Burial 9, I'm doing these in numerical order. Burial 9 was the first grave that was found after the beginning of the pandemic. I got a reading on a USA Continental button, and I thought I had one individual here. When we excavated last fall, it ended up being 5 individuals, 5 Continentals piled together. This is also burial 9. And, these 2 people on my left over here keep reappearing in my slides. They were primarily responsible for the physical removals, the sophisticated end of excavation cleaning and pedestaling and removal of elements because they know what they're doing. Burial 10 was a Continental loaded with USA buttons. This individual was so shallow that you can see the upper part of that central photo, that is the ground surface. This individual was so shallow that if his knees had not been weathered off or eaten away by animals or whatever, they would have protruded from the ground now. Not in 1780, but right now. Burial 11, 2 Continentals. Again, Continental buttons. Burial 12 had no buttons, but he had a Continental bayonet scabbard. And he was in an area where the Continentals were trying to leave the battlefield. They were trying to escape from the battlefield. So I am convinced that he's a Continental. It's very unlikely that he's not. And that bayonet scabbard tip is diagnostic of the Continental equipment and not something British. Burial 13, 3 Continentals. Also with USA buttons. I also want to point out that something that Bill instigated. At the very end of each removal, usually the skull was about the last thing to come out. It was usually the final container of remains that went to Bill's vehicle. And Bill instituted this tradition almost immediately that we should have a flag on it for this last container that went to the coroner's vehicle. And so here are shots from 3 different flag honors that took place during the course of the removals. This was done for each one of these guys, including the British soldier with the British flag, of course, as they left the battlefield. Okay, very quickly. The artifact collection from the burial project itself was not very interesting. The 71st soldier was probably the best group of artifacts. We managed to get a hold of everything that had ever been removed previously from that burial. And of course, we excavated everything else during the project. So we have, for example, this 71st Regiment Enlisted Men's Sword Shoulder Belt regimental device. And we have a large quantity of 71st Regiment buttons from this one individual. I think the only other thing on that individual was a double pair of brass sleeve buttons and a musket flint. USA buttons. The Continentals, except for the guy with the bayonet scabbard, were loaded with these Continental USA enlisted men's buttons, which were in terrible condition. I have a table full of these little containers of these disintegrated buttons, and I've got to try to do what I can with as many of them as possible. Here's what they should look like. Here's a French gun flint that was in burial 13, and a tin cup with the handle broken off, which was thrown in the top of burial 13, and I think it was probably used to dig or backfill the grave. And finally, we had a total of 9 fired musket balls and 2 fired buckshot that were in close association with the remains. I think it's likely that these were all wound-producing projectiles. I'm not going to go any further into that because I need to hand that off, but these guys, at least 8 of them had been shot with musket balls. Others may have been shot through and through with a bullet, and they've been bayoneted, and they've been clubbed to death. Who knows? I'll let Bill and Maddie get into that. Quickly, in conclusion, I have to say that I misjudged the level of effort that would be necessary to do this thing very badly. I don't know what I was thinking. Steve asked me my opinion about what I thought it would take to do this with the contract that we had with Doug. And yeah, don't listen to my estimates. Now, it wasn't just the fact that we ended up with 14 individuals instead of 5. There was also the fact that the bone ended up being in very poor condition, much worse off than we had anticipated. And that meant that each one of the individual excavations took probably twice as long as we had anticipated. So we needed some cavalry real fast right after the project got started. I mean, things were my planning. I'm not going to blame it on Steve. I'm going to say my planning was not very good. And we got that assistance immediately. We got it from the Richland County Coroner's Office. We got it from the DNR, Heritage Trust Archaeology Program, Historic Camden, Kershaw County, the TRC Archaeological Contracting Firm in Columbia, and a bunch of individuals. We had this amazing outpouring of largely unsolicited assistance. I mean, people just said, we'll help with this. And if that hadn't happened, we would have had kind of a mess. We'd probably still be out. And I would be very unpopular. So, having run over my time, I will pass this on to some real scientists.
Maddie and I are going to present the preliminary results of the study of the human remains of the soldiers at Camden, the bioarchaeology. We've chosen not to show too many images of the bodies, of the bones, and we've converted some to sort of line drawings, just out of respect for their identity and the fact that they fought and died that day. So we're going to tell you where we are with the study so far, and then lead into what could take place in future understanding of the lives of these men.
All right, so back in the fall, Bill and I were invited, much to our excitement, to participate in the bioarchaeology of the burials at the Battle of Camden. My troubles tonight. So bioarchaeology, simplified, is the study of human remains in an archaeological context in order to elucidate and gain insight into past life. So in the case of these burials, we were tasked with figuring out, well, first to exhume them and figuring out more about their lived experiences, as well as potential insight into their deaths. Many of you have been curious about us, why coroners were involved. Foremost, Bill and I are broadly bioarchaeologists, biological anthropologists, so trained in the study of the human skeleton and skeletal anatomy, as well as analyses involved in the study of such. Particularly with me, I've worked not only in archaeological contexts, such as the Battle of Camden, but also in anatomical collections, where people were medically dissected and placed into museum collections for the purposes of comparative study, in places like the Smithsonian as well as the Cleveland Museum of Natural History, where both places have largely conducted work. So it was such a privilege to get back in the field and be a part of this, and not just our everyday work, which is contemporary medical legal death investigation, where we assist in the recovery of human remains in contemporary settings, identification, as well as in certain cases help forensic pathologists with cause of death.
Okay, so my training at University of Georgia consisted of oh, yeah, go wrong. Then I went to USC for grad school, so consisted of getting involved in conflict context, war, genocide context from the start. So our professors took us to Guatemala to assist in training a team to recover the remains from mass graves of victims of genocide from the 1970s and 80s Mayan populations. So we got into some grim stuff starting out, but it has certainly taught me a lot in preparing for types of projects like this, where we're looking at the results of conflict between groups. I've also worked for the UN in Cyprus, where part of recovery and reconciliation between Greeks and Turks is recover the remains, identify them, and return them to their loved ones. So that's a background for both of us that made us appeal to Jim and Steve and the like for being involved in the project. And we have a good relationship with them for other projects, and we always answer when they call, and they're super to work with. So. Okay, so as I said, this was a massive effort of collaboration. DNR and SCIA are so good to work with. We developed a protocol for the field. So as biological anthropologists, we're interested in cause of death, traumatic injury, identification of a person. We're not interested in just the artifacts. Though we do have archaeological training, we wanted to ensure that there's a history of metal detection out here, finding an artifact and digging it up. What does that do to a skeleton? It damages it, especially the sensitive parts we want to look at to learn about individuals. So we developed a protocol in the field of being able to link artifacts with elements, bones of the skeleton, preserve that association, lift them in blocks of sand, transport them carefully arranged. Jim mentioned how fragile, friable, and degraded they are. So if you don't maintain anatomical order, you could lose it. They're just brought to us by archaeologists, unlabeled, not that they would have been, but we wouldn't know how to put these individuals back together. The soldiers need to be put back together, separated from each other. One individual, if there are 5 in a grave, overlapping, can be extremely complicated. So we are tasked with determining minimum number of individuals. A lot of conflict situations involve mass graves and commingled remains where we don't know the exact number. Maybe they are a secondary deposit, decomposed bodies on the surface of the ground, buried after the fact and jumbled together. That was the case in a lot of areas of the world with conflict and war. But here, we had some complicated scenarios that Maddie will talk about. We made a lot of diagrams in the field, a lot of measurements, and pondered these associations of 5 individuals buried together to ensure that we had each individual and the correct arm with the correct individual. We look at things like the size of the bones, the articulations, the joints, and we're able to hopefully match up and determine every part of the individual. So those are some field sketches we used. They look kind of primitive, but they are all parts of putting our brains together and really assessing the nature of the deposit and the associated musket balls, buttons, everything we find there. Jim described transport with respect, recovery from the field in order to go to the laboratory. And it was an honor to work with the veterans on the team and to carefully transport them back to the office for the cleaning and lab work that will ensue, that did ensue.
So we concluded field work November 8th, and very literally the next day, November 9th, we were in our lab. And we were fortunate to have continued use and hangout sessions with our friends from SKIA, archaeology friends, and Department of Natural Resources to continue helping us in this really large effort. When we got into the lab, we had to take a few days to figure out what we were going to do next. We had at that point developed a really good method out in the field, and none of us had tackled a project at this level with this many individuals who, in many cases, like Bill described, were still encased in soil matrices to protect them from damaging them in the field. So it took us a few days, and we got organized and made this binder with inventory sheets and things like that. Every individual was exhumed and carefully wrapped in foil and placed on trays. A person took up about 6 to 10 trays, so it was no small feat with an organization and a limited lab space. But we made it work quite well. And after we got our organization straight, we began the process of x-raying, which is the top photo. We have a mini x-ray machine at our coroner's office that has proved useful for many things. And the bottom image shows the cleaning process. So the soil matrix needed to come off after the bone had been x-rayed, which the next slide shows you how critical that was for certain surprise findings. And then we would photograph them before and after, so while they were still in soil and then later when we got to deeper analyses. So this process was painstaking and meticulous and had to be. It was very much important to take great care, particularly because these individuals, as everyone at this table has already said, very fragmented and fragile. They're 240-plus-year-old remains. So we were fortunate through our archaeology friend, John Fisher, who's in this room with us. He has a friend at the Warren Lash Lab, affiliated with Clemson and down at Charleston, that worked with the Hunley sub, and Joanna Rivera, and she is a conservator, and she came up to Columbia and gave us her time to teach us a little bit about conserving some of the remains. Some of the cortical surface of the bone, so the outer layer of the bone, was, once it had been exposed, no longer underground, had contact with oxygen and became even more fragile. And for two people who work with human remains, often this is nerve-wracking for us, and so it was very important to have someone help us with the conservation aspect. This is some of the surprise that we had, and these these are examples of artifacts that we found while x-raying. These don't look like bones, because at this point, this is when the remains were still encased in soil. So one image, oh, I didn't move it, I'm sorry, y'all. One image shows uniform buttons showing shanks next to an arm. Really cool to see that before. We saw examples of buttons in the field, plenty of them. But this was really neat to see before it had even really seen the light of day, since it was still encased in soil. And the other one is the neck area, again showing additional buttons. After the holidays, beginning in January, it was just the anthropology team. So me and Bill and our colleague and friend Rachel Baker, who helped us in this process immensely. At this point, all of the remains had been unfoiled and meticulously cleaned and dried, and so it was time for us to anatomically lay the skeleton out from head to toe to begin our process of data collection, and this is much like we do during forensic analyses as well. So we created a biological profile, which I'll explain more on the next slide, and go through with each individual from each burial. And start doing our metric and non-metric assessments, so general bone measurements and scoring techniques that are established in our field to gain better insight into things like stature, as well as age estimations and disease, trauma, these sorts of things. And again, you'll notice a theme: photographing and x-raying everything along the way. So biological profile is very standard, and the first thing that we tackle for a forensic case of an unidentified individual. So in the case of the burials from the Battle of Camden, every single person. So we estimated their biological sex using skeletal indicators that I'll explain, age at death, how old were these individuals when they died, their stature estimate or their living height, an ancestry estimate, and any sort of unique physical characteristic. We've gotten many questions and amazement and how much you can glean from the human skeleton, which is why I got involved in this field early on in college, because it's just fascinating to be able to know so much about a person by just their bones. So we have age estimations for these individuals. You'll notice some of them are kind of broad categories. The adults are broader than the juveniles for reasons that I will explain. These individuals, again, were very fragmented, and the methods that we employed varied due to these preservation limitations. The biggest and most important skeletal indicators, which Bill and I held out deep hope for with every excavation, are two indicators found on the pelvis, the front as well as the back. And these are non-weight-bearing joints. The surfaces degenerate pretty uniformly over one's life course, and this makes them a really great area of the body to estimate age at death. We only had one pubic symphysis for one person, and so, but really every time we really did hold out hope. So we employed multiple methods, which is a good idea no matter what. So we employed cranial suture closure, so looking at the different bones involved in the skull and how they fuse together and obliterate over time, these suture lines, as well as dental occlusal wear, which are the two lowered images, one showing the method itself and one showing some of the mandibular molars from the individual burial 12. And this is the chewing surface of your tooth and how it wears over time. And there are standards and methods to refer to look at age based upon this occlusal wear. So the age at death estimations, thank you both. For the subadults, so people below the age of 20, of which we had 5 of the 14 individuals, which may come as a surprise. It was a big surprise to us as well. It's easier to predict more precise ages for these individuals due to the predictability of growth and development. So the X-ray image is not from one of our individuals, but it is an example to show you these growth plates. You can see the line. This is the knee joint, so your lower femur and the upper part of your tibia. showing growth lines. And in the field, we noticed for burial 13 that there were some extra bone, and immediately realized this is an unfused growth plate. So we knew at the time that these were teenagers, and when we got back into the lab, we're better equipped to estimate their ages more accurately. So these individuals, the teenagers, ranged in age from 15 to 19 years of age. And again, the 9 adults, you'll see broader age ranges over the age of 20. Some have a little bit more precision, 20 to 35, but there are broader age ranges, and I want you to know it's due to the limitations based upon the preservation. Another part of the biological profile is stature estimation. People were particularly curious about the Highlander's height, and he was a tall, burly man. And come to find out, he wasn't particularly tall, but I'm sure he was burly. And in fact, we know he was burly, but I'll give that to Bill. In the case of these individuals, we used the maximum length of the femur, so the thigh bone, to measure, based upon an established formula in our field, to estimate the living height of individuals. For us, the mean stature of all of these, which we could measure 12 of the 14 due to preservation, there were about 5'7", and the graph shows you the differences. We had an individual that was as small as 5'2", that was one of our teenagers, so he wasn't done growing yet. And burial 12, he was 5'11", around 5'11", so he was quite tall. Research into Revolutionary War sites, which is few and far between, actually found the same mean stature, so the same average height, which was neat to see.
All right, during our analysis, we wanted to also assess indicators of the health of these individuals: disease, pathology, injury. We found pretty ubiquitous and common among 19th century, 18th century skeletons is the indicators in the bones and teeth that show when someone was subjected to nutritional stress, maybe malnutrition, fevers, febrile illness as a child. When they're growing and developing, they preserve as lines on your teeth and bones of growth disruption. So you can see where they stop growing because they're fighting an infection, they're facing health challenge, and then they resume growing and a permanent mark is preserved. So throughout the teeth of most of the individuals, we saw enamel defects that are common that tell us, and we've measured them, we know about the time they occur during development, and they vary, but they reflect the disease environment and the nutrition that these developing individuals faced. So oral health also, by and large, I've looked at Civil War soldiers. By and large, these guys they were a young sample of individuals, but they had better teeth. So pre-sugar, there's not a lot of carbohydrates and sugar involved. They weren't getting that. They don't have the level of cavities that we see among 19th century and modern individuals, and no overt signs of infection of the gums. A few of the older individuals have lost teeth during life and show the closing and remodeling of the bone of the jaw when they lose their teeth and those sockets heal up. We also wanted to look at traumatic injury, of course, in the battlefield context, and anything that suggests what led to these men's unfortunate death. I put the Highlander here, so a Scotsman smoking a pipe. So, with the dental health, these guys had crowded dentition, malocclusion, rotated teeth. They had all the things that occurred pre-dentistry, crowded mouths full of teeth, and...
This thing is lagging. It's not...
Okay. Yeah, so they also ground their teeth. When looking at these age estimates that Maddie described, we're comparing with published standards from different times in history, but these guys probably ate a diet including stone ground, cornmeal and flour, etc., that would have worn their teeth down at much greater, or much earlier decades in life than we face these days. Military requirements, we are aware of published military requirements for having anterior teeth for the purpose of biting paper cartridges, etc. So we don't know exactly, I don't, maybe Jim does, what those were, and Steve, back then, but these guys also could potentially show us occupational indicators, so use of the teeth as a tool, right? Holding a nail as a carpenter in your teeth. We chose the Scottish man with the pipe because the 71st Highlander has a oval facet in his canine, maxillary canine, which is consistent with holding that pipe habitually, that clay pipe in his mouth. We also conjecture that a lot of the grinding in offset patterns in the mouth is the result of combat stress. People are very stressed out. I ground my teeth a lot in graduate school. I cannot imagine being in combat and what that could produce, but next. Okay, so we knew there would be gunshot trauma. We have very large caliber soft lead musket balls flying all around. We have the evidence for them in the ground. We have the evidence that many of them impacted bone, the signature that they impacted bone. We don't see what we see in the modern forensic context. We see, in your average autopsy or in skeletal remains that we look at with gunshot wounds, they show the effect of great energy, velocity, radiating fractures, beveling, concentric fracture patterns. We saw more simple fracture patterns here so far at Camden. So I've looked at some published studies that show the rapid deceleration of large caliber round balls and the fact that they within under 100 yards are pretty ineffective in terms of accuracy. Velocity loss is extreme and they bounce and roll on the ground. So the wounds we see in the men that we documented produce rather simple fractures. They did, embed on the bone and deform to the shape of the bone and reflect the lower velocities and ballistics of the day. Where is the sharp force injury? Where are the bayonet wounds? Where are the cuttings marked by saber wounds, etc., sword wounds? We don't have it, so it is largely due to the degradation of the bone. The ends of the bones didn't preserve well. Those are the spongy, articular surfaces and trabecular bone of your skeleton. They didn't survive very well. So if there were limbs that were cut off, we don't see the cut marks. Also, the vertebrae and the ribs, where you bayonet someone, those bones are gone because they're thin and because of the effects of time, acidity of the soil, and just general preservation of the skeletons. I thought this was pretty telling. So Jim produced lots of 5-gallon buckets of soil, and the purpose for having these buckets from where every man was buried was to place some soil in the coffins with them, to be with them when they're reburied. So these were screened, they're free of any human remains and artifacts. I took them and dumped them where I had a hole in the yard to fill in, and this shows the color differential. Within one site, the Battle of Camden, the battleground, look at all the different colors of soil. So this explains the condition of some men versus the condition of others. So we have all the factors to consider: the soil type, the pH of the soil, whether it's acidic like your average red clay soil, sand versus clay, the drainages in the declivity areas, the depth of burial, lots of factors. Of course, the impact of agriculture and logging all affected the survival of the skeletons. So some of our graves one grave in particular was right in the line of where Farmer John drove his tractor for years and years. The two ruts went right over the grave, and you could see the compression of the individuals. So, the X-rays on the right are of the femur of the Highlander up top, showing you the preservation level. That almost looks like a modern X-ray of the sandy beach soil, just like beach sand, and then beneath it is one of our poorly preserved limb bones from one of the areas in more acidic red clays. Okay.
we had a total of 17 graves and 14 individuals. Sorry, 7 graves, not 17. We had 7 graves and 14 individuals. I'm so sorry. And of those 7 graves, only 4 of them contained one singular individual. So the rest of them contained more than one, which, as Bill discussed earlier, is another reason that we were involved to help with the commingled nature of them. So at this point, we're going to go through each of these 7 graves and 14 individuals to give you their biological profiles and any sort of traumatic injury, or in the event of no skeletal traumatic injury, associations with musket balls or other artillery that Jim had helped us assign to each individual.
Here is our 71st Highlander. So he is one individual and given a Christian burial by his men with his hands kind of clasped near his pelvis. The deepest, I'd say the deepest of the burials. He was positioned supine, and we estimate he is male looking at all of the features of his skeleton. He was not particularly tall, and he was an adult. He did not have the signs of arthritis, degenerative change that we see in middle to later adults. So, and given his fairly average stature among the men, he nonetheless, we think, was biomechanically very well built, like a brick house. So this man would have been, his pelvis was wide, his femurs are just very robust. He reflects the muscle attachment sites of someone who has marched for thousands of miles and probably was selected for his imposing physique. So he was definitely an imposing figure on the battlefield. So for traumatic injury, we have shown the base of his skull, so right back here on the occipital bone. And this is one of our most convincing evidence of blunt force injury. So he was probably struck, could have been struck with the butt of a musket or bludgeoned with some other blunt force. Can't rule out projectile trauma, musket ball, canister shot, but it does have the characteristics of a blunt force injury that was sustained at the time of death, and he was buried with those fractures in place, and his skull was incomplete, so parts of the skull were absent as well. We don't know if that's due to the fact that also that pine trees grew through parts of his skeleton. So, burial 4, as Doug described, we identified him in the process of taking an X-ray and receiving him in the laboratory and cleaning his remains as having Native American ancestry. This is based on the shovel-shaped characteristics of his incisors, which are mean Asian ancestry. In the context of our history, this means Native American ancestry in the New World. Lots of the other guys, we don't have an ancestry estimate because their faces were not preserved. They did not survive. So we can't measure the face and say this person was likely European American or African American. We don't know. We have assumptions about the battlefield and the demographics. Burial 4 was finished developing 20 to 35, we estimate. We may be able to refine these age estimates going forward with further study. And he was quite tall, 5'8" to 5'10", and we identified no artifacts with him and no evidence for injury.
Burial 9 consisted of 5 commingled U.S. Continental soldiers. We have pictures here of the individuals laid out in our lab in anatomical position, as well as the middle picture is in the field when we were trying to figure out, after they've been exposed, just who was who and where, as well as a great sketch done by archaeologist John Fisher to represent these people in the grave. They were all supine, so they were face up for the most part, or bodies up, sometimes faces turned in different ways. And again, commingled, arms across each other in some cases, multiple pelvises on top of each other. It really took Bill and I a long time, with help of everybody on site, to figure out how to begin exhuming them. Their age at death ranged from 16 to 45, and I'll go through each individual. So 9A and 9B, we estimated both are biological males. 9A is an adult over the age of 20. Due to preservation, we were not able to get more precise than that. A younger individual between 5'2" and 5'5". And this individual had some trauma, which we have pictures of on the next slide, so I'll hold off on that. 9B, we mentioned that the burial 13 consisted of 3 teenagers. We didn't realize until we got back to the lab that this commingled grave of 5 people also contained 2 additional teenagers, so it upped our number in a surprising way. This individual, based upon his growth plates, was about 16 to 18 years of age, but rather tall, between 5'7" and 5'9", and had no evidence for any skeletal traumatic injury. This is a picture of his right upper arm, so the right humerus, and this is one of only about 4 individuals that we have what we call in situ trauma. So this musket ball was found right on this individual's humerus at the time of excavation. The image alongside it is an X-ray showing this association. Once the musket ball was picked up, it was heavily deformed and contoured to the surface of the bone. And underneath, as you can see in the X-ray quite well, a very likely perimortem fracture that occurred around the time of this individual's death. Two additional individuals, also estimated to be males. Another teenager, this is our second one of the 5, between 16 and 19, 5'6" to 5'8" living stature. And several of these individuals had fractures of their thigh bones, their femurs, and we think that it's likely due to rough handling of the body post-mortem when these individuals were being put into the grave. And we don't see it as something that they endured during life. 9D was between 30 and 40 years old, between 5'4" and 5'7" in terms of his stature. And although we didn't have any evidence for skeletal traumatic injury, Jim located a musket ball near the right shoulder of this individual. And last but not least, the 5th individual in this burial, we were not able to determine an estimation for biological sex due to very poor preservation. We believe him to be between 20 to 45 years of age at the time of death, and between 5'4" and 5'7". And again, another individual that doesn't demonstrate any skeletal signs of injury, but had a heavily deformed musket ball from the abdominal region, which, if you recall Bill talking about the ribs as well as the vertebral column, that was not well preserved at all.
Burial 10 was one individual in a grave, and he was very shallow. The femur, Jim mentioned, the knees would have been protruding from the ground. He was likely impacted by logging operations. He is supine, and he shows us some interesting features about the burial. So he's in a position of having his legs flexed like that, probably reflecting burial during decomposition, maybe a day or two later in the hot August sun. So he was likely a bloated, decomposing body that was buried. He may have been dug into by animals or disturbed by other means. He shows evidence of secondary burial. So up top in the sketch there, you can see a pile of what represents a pile of arm bones. They are stacked like Lincoln logs. They were placed back in the grave. The skull is oriented entirely wrong, and the mandible is somewhere else. So he was likely buried by a Good Samaritan after the fact of his bones being disturbed. Historical accounts mention the bones lying littering the battlefield after the fact, those who did not get buried or those who were disturbed by feral hogs, dogs, etc. He is estimated to be male, and one of our older individuals, 40 to 50, maybe more, and couldn't determine his stature because the long bones were not very intact. We couldn't measure a femur that had been plowed through or run over by logging trucks. No evidence for trauma, but he did have a buckshot recovered near him and a musket ball near his knee. And as I said, that he shows that sign of secondary burial. Burial 11 consisted of 2 individuals together, and they were about 36 centimeters deep on average, and they are both adults. 20 to 45 is our estimate so far, positioned supine in the grave. 11A, estimated male based on measuring the features of his bone, of his pelvis and skull, looking at his jaw and features of the skull. He is tall, somewhere 5'7", 5'10", and had no evidence for any injury. 11B was one of those where we found with radiology up front, we found a metal projectile, lead projectile associated with his skull. It's buckshot, which is on his parietal bone. This may have been not even penetrated the skull. In autopsies, we often see shotgun pellets that have lost energy retained in the scalp of an individual. So he could have, caught some buckshot, and it's there. There was a defect underneath the buckshot, but lead is so heavy that when it gets compressed in soft bone, it's gonna, we didn't see fractures or anything. It was likely just in his scalp. And burial 12 is a Continental soldier who was a bit disturbed and missing a leg bone, one individual. He was supine, estimated to be male based on the features of his skull and long bones and pelvis. And 35 to 45 was our best estimate using certain methods. And he's our tallest individual, 5'10" to 6 feet tall. So we did not document any skeletal injury on him.
The final burial that we'll tell you all about tonight consists of 3 individuals, and this is a burial of the 3 teenagers. They were all supine, so face up, commingled, less complicated than the 5 people, but still a challenge in its ways. This, as you can see, our field sketch with our notes. And just like burial 10 shows signs of bloating, so early onset decomposition, and then buried shortly thereafter. And again, these are adolescents between 15 and 19 years of age. 13A, it was estimated to be a biological male between 17 and 19 years at death, with a stature of 5'5" to 5'8". And these are images of this individual's lower spine, his lumbar spine and the lower back. The first image on this side is in situ, so in the field. This is what we discovered, is a musket ball in this individual's spine, and then we see the radiographic image of the impact, and the one furthest this way is after we got done cleaning, and we're showing this association. You can see that it would have been quite complicated, and it could have easily been missed as an impact. Given the fragmented nature and the poor preservation of these remains, it was really critical for us to have seen this in the field itself. In addition to this gunshot wound in his lower spine, there was another musket ball recovered in the vicinity of his left elbow. The final 2 individuals in this grave, one was estimated as biological male, the other, again, we were unable to determine due to preservation. 13B with 17 to 19 years at death, and taller, 5'8" to 5'10". He also did not have any evidence for skeletal injury, but did have a musket ball recovered from his right elbow. So one in the left, the previous individual, and this guy in the right. Our final individual, 13C, is our youngest of the whole 14 individuals, with an estimation of about 15 to 18 years of age, based upon his growth plates and the lack of fusion in many places, including the upper arm, knees, upper thigh, and places located on the long bones. He may have had a possible perimortem trauma on his right parietal bone on the side of his skull.
Okay, so where are we going from here? So yesterday we put the soldiers in their coffins and sealed them, and today they were escorted from the lab to here. We have retained, with the permission and the interest of the directors of the project, DNA samples of molar teeth, certain other single-rooted teeth, and hard, preserved, compact bone from the base of the skull or the long bones. We are going to submit quality control samples to an ancient DNA lab to see if we can sequence DNA profiles complete enough to do ancestry, genetic genealogy studies, and link related individuals to these individuals who died that day. So that remains to be determined. We'll find that out in the coming months as to whether the DNA is too degraded to work with, or whether it is sequences and produces good profile. There are many interested parties who have ancestral ties to the Battle of Camden. There remains the possibility of submitting to databases to compare and generate relationships based on the DNA, the genetics of these individuals. Dr. Delacova from USC is going to be conducting some isotopic studies, so looking at carbon, nitrogen, oxygen ratios, strontium in the bones, chemical indicators that can tell us information about the soldiers. Where were they born? Where did they grow up as their teeth were forming, as their bones were forming? The signatures of their environment, their drinking water, the geology can be preserved in these hard tissues of the body and tell you where they came from geographically, tell you about their diet, and other such, where they might have gone later in life, migration patterns. They're all using these types of bone chemistry studies. So she's also taken soil samples. We collected soil samples from each individual that may reflect the abdominal area, the contents of the parasite load that these individuals are carrying. We know they were not well. They had burdens of illness, dysentery, poor rations, and testing for that sort of thing can give us more information about their suffering and untimely death.
A big question that we got very early on in the project, and a big hope that we maintained throughout, was the possibility of facial reconstruction. But facial reconstruction involves having the bones of the face present, and the bones of the face are very fragile, thin bone, and unfortunately, I think it will come as no surprise that they did not preserve well. So that is something that we're sad about, but hold out hope in the future for advances in reconstruction for the parts of the face and mandible that did survive.
Yeah, we have had the pleasure of working with state law enforcement's forensic artists over the years, in both for identification, generating leads for identifying individuals in modern times, but also in reconstructing the faces of 19th century individuals. We've done that a lot when remains are found. And it really requires the measurements of the eyes, the cheekbones, zygomatics, and the things, as Maddie said, that don't survive very well in acidic soil. We took great efforts to preserve, conserve the skulls, digitize them. We have 3D renderings. So, and the future of the project might hold that some are better preserved. We shall see, with the ability to look at, approximate the face of one of the soldiers, but not yet. We'd like to thank everyone who supported and encouraged this project, to thank our boss, Coroner Rutherford, for allowing us to assist these agencies in this important historical project to protect and preserve and rebury these individuals. Everyone else listed here, and those are the coffins draped yesterday and in their first repose, I guess, at our external area, ready to be received and placed on the Humvees.
And that's all we have. Thank you so much.